The man hit the dirt so hard the whole corral seemed to shake with him. Dust flew up around his face. His hat rolled under the fence. One boot came off and landed near the water trough. The black stallion stood over him for one sharp second, breathing hard, neck arched, eyes full of warning. Then the horse turned away on his own, proud as a king, as if the man on the ground was not worth another look. Catherine Sterling did not rush down from the porch. She did not cry out. She only folded her arms tighter and watched the 25th man drag himself through the fence while the crowd went quiet around him. Then she lifted her chin and said in a voice cold enough to stop every whisper in the yard, "If there are any real cowboys left in this valley, one of them can prove it on my stallion." No one answered her right away. That silence told more truth than all the bragging from the past 3 weeks. Men had come to her ranch loud and laughing. Men had come with ropes, silver bits, soft words, cruel hands, and too much faith in themselves. Every one of them had left sore, angry, and smaller than when he came. Catherine had watched all of it with the still face of a woman who was done being fooled by swagger. $50 in gold still waited in the pocket of her apron, untouched. But the money had never been the point, and the smarter folks in Dry Creek were finally beginning to understand that. The stallion's name was Nightfire, and he had not belonged to just anyone. He had belonged to her husband, Eli Sterling, the only man who had ever sat that horse and made it look like prayer instead of battle. Eli had not beaten the animal into obedience. He had not shamed him or starved him or worn him down. He had listened. That was what Catherine remembered most. A sick man with death already standing near his shoulder had walked into that corral 3 winters ago and come out 10 minutes later with tears in his eyes and sunlight on his face. He had told her that horse was waiting for a man who knew the difference between taking and earning. The next day Eli was dead, and Catherine was left with a ranch, a grave, and a black stallion who had not let another soul stay on his back since. The town talked, of course. It always did. Some said Catherine had turned bitter after burying her husband. Some said she liked seeing proud men humbled. Some said the horse had gone mean in the head and should have been shot before he crippled someone. Catherine let them talk until they ran out of breath. She kept feeding Nightfire with her own hands. She kept standing near the fence when fools came to test him. She kept waiting because she had seen something the others had not. She had seen a horse refuse 25 liars and 1 true man, and she believed the animal was still telling the same truth. That was why she stood on the porch that morning with her back straight and grief hidden deep, looking over the crowd like a judge who had heard enough nonsense for 1 lifetime. By sundown the story had traveled far beyond Dry Creek Valley. It went down cattle trails and into bunkhouses. It crossed card tables and cook fires. It reached a lonely line shack nearly 40 miles away where a man named Luke Merritt sat by a weak fire with a tin cup cooling in his hand. He heard it from an old drover who stopped for water and stayed long enough to talk. A widow, a black stallion, 25 failures, $50. Most men would have heard the gold and nothing else. Luke barely heard the gold at all. What stayed with him was one simple detail. The widow had said she wanted a real cowboy, not the loudest one. He sat with that thought long after the drover left, staring into the coals like they might answer a question he had been carrying for years. Luke had lived too long with silence to mistake it for peace. He worked for the bar and spread, mending fence, doctoring calves, and sleeping where the land told him to sleep. It was good work for a man who did not care to be known. He had once been younger, quicker to laugh, quicker to trust, quicker to believe a life could bend toward something warm. Then the war took its share from him and left the rest half buried inside. Since then he had kept to horses better than people. Horses did not ask what he had seen. They did not offer pity. They did not lie. If they feared you, they stepped away. If they trusted you, they came close. Luke liked the honesty of that. So when he heard about a stallion that refused every man who came at him wrong, something old and sore inside him stirred awake. He did not sleep much that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw a black horse fighting off hand after hand, and a widow standing nearby as if she were guarding more than land. Before dawn, he saddled his bay gelding buck and packed little more than coffee, jerky, and a bedroll. He told no one where he was going because there was no one to tell. The ride south took him through broken mesa country where the ground split into red cuts and the wind always sounded like a warning. He kept an easy seat and let Buck choose the surest footing. Around noon he reached a ridge and saw Dry Creek Valley spread below him, green where water held, gold where it did not, with fences cutting the land into patient squares. He might have turned back then. A smarter man might have. But from down in the valley came a sound that traveled straight through bone, a stallion's cry sharp and wild, and Luke felt Buck's ears jump forward under him. By the time he reached the Sterling place, another small crowd had gathered near the corral, hoping to see either a miracle or a wreck. Luke tied Buck by the barn and walked in without hurry. That was the first thing Catherine noticed. No strut, no grin, no friends at his back. Just a lean cowboy in a weathered coat, hat low, hands quiet at his sides, looking at the horse before he looked at her. Nightfire stood inside the corral, black coat shining under the late sun, muscles tight, head high. Even at a distance he looked like trouble with a heartbeat. Luke stopped at the fence and rested one arm on the top rail. He did not whistle. He did not click his tongue. He did not act as though he had come to conquer anything. Catherine came down from the porch slowly, and when she reached the yard she asked the question she had asked every man before him. Are you here for the gold or for the horse? Luke turned then and she saw a face made older by hard things. Not old in years, old in the eyes. He touched the brim of his hat, more habit than charm. He said he had enough beans to keep himself fed, so it was not the gold. A few men in the crowd laughed at that, but he paid them no mind. Catherine studied him, taking in the worn gloves, the clean gear, the stillness in him. Most men talked too much around a challenge. This one seemed to be listening. She asked what made him think he could do what 25 others could not. Luke looked back at the stallion and answered in a voice low and plain. He said maybe he could not. He said maybe the better question was whether the horse wanted anything to do with him at all. That answer did something to the air between them. Catherine felt it at once. It did not soften her. She was not that easy, but it made her pay closer attention. She stepped up beside him at the fence, close enough to smell dust on his coat and coffee on his breath. She told him the rules, 10 minutes on Nightfire's back. No tricks, no cruelty, no coming back if he failed. Luke nodded as though each word mattered. Then he asked her something no one else had asked. He asked what her husband had done different. Catherine looked at him for a long second, and the yard around them seemed to fall away. Then she said Eli had treated the horse like a soul, not a prize. Luke let that settle. Inside the corral, Nightfire stopped pacing and turned his head toward the fence. The crowd leaned in. Catherine did not breathe. The black stallion took one slow step toward the man in the weathered hat, and for the first time in 3 years, hope frightened her more than failure ever had. Luke did not move when Nightfire stepped closer. That was the second thing Catherine noticed. Most men reached too soon. They saw one small sign and rushed at it like hungry gamblers throwing down their last coin. Luke stayed where he was, one arm on the fence, body easy, eyes on the stallion without staring him down. Nightfire came another step, then another, black ears flicking forward and back, testing the air between them. Dust shifted around his hooves. The yard had gone so quiet that Catherine could hear the leather creak when Luke slowly took his hand off the rail. Easy now, he said, and his voice carried no challenge in it. Nightfire stopped 10 feet away. His nostrils widened. He threw his head once, not in fear, not in temper, but like a creature weighing truth. Luke did not reach out. He let the stallion keep his pride. Catherine felt her own fingers knot together inside her apron. She had seen men pretend patience before. This was not pretending. This man knew stillness. He wore it like old skin. One of the town men muttered that the horse was just measuring the next fool. Catherine shot him a look sharp enough to shut him up. Her eyes went back to Luke. She could see now that he carried no crop, no heavy bit, no fancy tack meant to force a beast into obedience. Just a coil of rope at his hip and the plain gear of a working cowboy. That should not have mattered, but it did. Her late husband had always said a horse could tell the difference between a man who came prepared to fight and a man who came ready to listen. Luke leaned one shoulder against the fence and spoke again, softer this time, as if he were telling the stallion a thing meant for no other ears. He said he knew what it was to have hands always trying to push you where you did not want to go. He said he knew what it felt like to be cornered by people who thought they had a right to your spirit. Catherine did not know whether Nightfire understood the words. She did know the horse heard something in the man's tone because the stallion lowered his head 1 inch. That was all, just 1 inch, but it was more than he had given any of the 25 before him. A memory rose in Catherine so fast it nearly took her breath. Eli in that same yard, pale from fever, telling her the best horses were not won by strength. They were won by honesty. She had clung to those words through 3 winters and more lonely nights than she cared to count. Now they came back and stood beside her like a ghost. Luke looked over at her then. Not long, just enough to ask without asking. Catherine nodded once and opened the gate. A murmur ran through the crowd. Men shifted closer to the rails. A boy climbed halfway up a post for a better look. Luke stepped through the opening and pulled the gate shut behind him. Nightfire moved off at once, circling wide, head high again. The closeness of the yard changed the air. The stallion's power felt bigger in there, packed into muscle and breath and hard hooves. Luke turned slowly with him, staying near the center of the corral, not blocking, not chasing. He let the horse choose the distance. Catherine came to the fence and wrapped both hands around the top rail. Her heart was beating harder than she liked. She told herself it was because a ranch horse was too valuable to see ruined by one man's mistake. That was only part of it, and she knew better. The rest of it was more dangerous. It was the thin, bright ache of wanting something again. Nightfire completed 1 circle, then a second. Each pass brought him a little closer. Luke spoke now and then, not filling the silence, only touching it. He said the stallion did not owe anybody a thing. He said he was not there to steal what had been guarded so hard. He said if there was a road between them, the horse had every right to decide whether to open it. Those words made Catherine's throat tighten. No man had spoken like that in her yard since Eli died. At last Luke stopped moving. He stood with both hands easy at his sides and let Nightfire come. The stallion reached him by inches, neck stretched, breath warm in the late afternoon. Luke lifted his hand very slowly, palm open. Nightfire sniffed his fingers. The whole yard seemed to hold one breath. Luke's hand did not jump. It settled at the base of the horse's neck, light as if he were touching flame. Nightfire shivered once under the contact, then he stood. A sound escaped somebody at the fence, not quite a word, more like disbelief made audible. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes and hated them at once. She blinked them back. She had not cried when Eli died, not in front of people. She had not cried when neighbors came with casseroles and pity. She had not cried when the bank man hinted she ought to sell land before a widow ruined herself trying to keep it. But this simple sight, one man's hand resting gentle on a black neck that had rejected everyone else, struck somewhere deep and unguarded. Luke kept his hand where it was. He worked it along the shoulder, then back to the neck, learning the horse through touch. Nightfire stayed alert, but his tightness changed. It no longer looked like war, it looked like attention. Luke moved to the stallion's left side and gathered up the rope halter lying near the fence. He did not try to slip it on at once. He showed it to the horse first, letting him see, smell, and think. Nightfire pinned his ears for a moment, then eased again when Luke waited. Time passed that way, slow and careful. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretched. A breeze moved across the yard and lifted loose strands of Catherine's hair. Nobody left. Nobody even coughed. Luke finally set the rope around Nightfire's neck and stood beside him without pulling. The stallion tossed his head once, testing. Luke went with the motion instead of against it. That small choice mattered. Catherine saw it. So did the horse. "You ever done this before?" one old rancher asked from the rail. Luke did not take his eyes off Nightfire. "Been trying to learn my whole life," he said. The old rancher gave a low grunt that sounded almost like respect. It took another long stretch before Luke made any move toward mounting. He rubbed Nightfire's shoulder, stepped back, stepped in again. He put weight in the stirrup strap, then took it away. Every time the stallion tensed, Luke paused. Every time the horse settled, he advanced 1 inch more. It was not a fight. It was a conversation. Catherine understood that now with painful clarity. All these weeks she had watched men storm into that corral asking the wrong question. Can I ride him? Luke was asking a different one. Will you have me? When at last he drew himself up and laid his chest across Nightfire's back, a woman in the crowd whispered a prayer. Luke stayed there, not swinging over, just breathing with the horse. Nightfire's muscles bunched hard enough to show under the hide. Catherine felt her own body tighten in answer. Then the stallion exhaled, long and rough, and the tension eased. Luke slid back down and stroked the neck again. He was thanking him. Catherine knew it by the look of it. The second time he tried, he moved a little farther, a leg over, weight settling, hands light. Nightfire stiffened, one ear cut back. Luke bent his head and spoke low near the mane. Nobody heard the words. Catherine watched the horse listen. That was the strange part, not obey. Listen. Then Nightfire took one step forward. The crowd broke into sound at once, but Catherine raised a hand and silenced them. This was too fine a thing to be trampled by noise. Luke sat the stallion like a man who had no wish to win by force. He did not grip hard. He did not saw at the rope. He simply moved with the horse through one slow turn of the corral. Nightfire walked, then halted, then turned his head as if to ask whether this man would start demanding now that he had gotten what he wanted. Luke only rested a hand near the withers and waited. Catherine could not look away. She had seen this once before. Another man. Another season. Another life. Eli had looked that way the day before he died. Not triumphant, not proud, grateful. The memory hit so hard that she had to brace herself against the fence. Nightfire took another step, then a third. The sunset caught along his black coat and made it shine blue at the edges. Luke guided nothing. He followed. Together they crossed the corral in a line so quiet and natural it seemed impossible that this same horse had thrown 25 men into dust and shame. Catherine felt something shift inside her, something she had boarded up with hard work and habit. It frightened her because she knew what came with hope. Hope invited loss. Hope made room for need. And need had already buried one man she loved. Luke brought Nightfire to a stop near the center of the yard. He slid down just as carefully as he had gone up. The stallion stayed beside him. No buck, no bolt, no fury. Just a black horse breathing hard and watching the man at his shoulder like a door had opened and he was not yet sure what stood on the other side of it. Luke turned to the fence. His face was calm, but there was wonder in it now, plain as daylight. Catherine stepped through the gate before she could stop herself. She stood 3 feet away from him and the horse, her pulse uneven. Nightfire leaned his head slightly toward Luke's shoulder. How long? Luke asked quietly. Catherine swallowed. 3 minutes, she said. Then after a beat, no one else ever got that far. For the first time his eyes met hers full on. They were not cold at all, just tired, honest. And carrying more pain than any man should have had to drag across this earth alone. He nodded once, then laid a hand on Nightfire's neck again, as if the minutes did not matter half as much as the trust. Catherine looked from the stallion to the cowboy and understood something she had not wanted to name. The real danger was no longer that Luke Merritt might fail. The real danger was that he might succeed, and if he did, nothing in her life would stay the same. Luke did not ask to try again that same evening. That, more than anything, unsettled Catherine. Any other man would have pushed his luck while the yard still buzzed with shock and admiration. Any other man would have wanted witnesses when he climbed back into that saddle. Luke only thanked her for opening the gate, gave Nightfire one last slow stroke along the neck, and stepped away like a man who knew enough not to grab at a thing before it was ready. He crossed the yard, untied his bay gelding and touched the brim of his hat. "I can come back tomorrow if you mean to let me," he said. Catherine had half expected him to ask for the cabin, the supper table, some share of her kindness just because he had managed what others could not. But he asked for nothing. The light was going copper across the valley when she answered. She told him there was a bunkhouse room sitting empty near the south shed if he needed a roof for the night. Luke hesitated as though measuring whether to accept even that. Then he nodded once and thanked her plain and simple. Catherine turned before he could see how that small courtesy reached her deeper than grand words ever had. She did not sleep much. The ranch house felt too full of memory and too empty of sound. She banked the kitchen fire, checked the locks she always checked, and stood by the back window with her hand against the frame. Beyond the yard, the bunkhouse lamp burned low. Beyond that lay the corrals and the dark shape of Nightfire moving once in the moonlight. Catherine told herself the trouble in her chest came from practical worries. A strange man on the ranch. A valuable stallion stirred up after years of refusal. A whole town ready to carry gossip by breakfast. But when she finally went to bed, the face she saw was not the town's or the horse's. It was Luke's when he had asked how long, like the number mattered less than the miracle. The next morning came with a hard blue sky and the clean chill that rides into ranch country before the sun has earned its heat. Catherine was already in the yard when Luke stepped from the bunkhouse. He had washed at the pump. His hair was still damp at the temples. He looked almost younger in the morning light, until he turned, and she saw the same guarded weight settle back into his expression. He came toward the corral without hurry, and Nightfire, who usually paced before strangers like a storm behind wire, lifted his head and watched in stillness. "Coffee," Catherine said, holding out a tin cup. Luke took it with a quiet thanks. Their fingers brushed for less than a breath, but Catherine felt it all the way to her shoulders. She disliked that at once. A woman who managed land, accounts, hired men, calving troubles and drought had no business being undone by a brush of skin. She reminded herself of that and asked him where he had learned to handle horses. He drank before answering. Said his father had worked remount stock before he died. Said after that he had learned from horses themselves, mostly by making mistakes he survived. There was no brag in it, only fact. "You speak like a man who has had to survive a good many things," Catherine said. Luke stared into the dark coffee for a moment. "More than I aimed for, ma'am. She should have left it there. A sensible woman would have." Instead she asked whether the war had taken the rest. His jaw changed just a little. He looked out toward the east pasture and said yes, not all at once, not in one grand wound men could point to and admire, piece by piece, sleep first, then ease, then whatever part of him had once believed the world might hold a place worth coming home to. Catherine stood very still. She knew something about losing in pieces. After Eli died, it had not been one grief. It had been 100 small thefts. His boots by the door, his cough missing from dawn, the extra plate no longer needed at supper. Nightfire snorted from inside the corral, and both of them turned toward the sound like two people grateful for an escape from truth. This time Luke entered the pen before the yard could gather a crowd. Only 2 ranch hands from the neighboring place had ridden up early, and they stood by the fence in respectful silence. Catherine liked that better. Less noise, less performance. Luke seemed to like it too. He stepped inside with the same plain patience as the day before. Nightfire circled once, then came near enough to breathe against his shoulder. Luke smiled at that. Not a wide smile. Just something quick and real that changed his whole face before it vanished again. Catherine saw it and had to look away. The work went farther this time. Luke touched the horse, walked him, set the rope, laid weight across his back, mounted, dismounted, mounted again. Each step was earned and slow. Catherine watched the two of them shape trust out of nothing but patience. It did not look dramatic. That was the strange beauty of it. No rearing, no violent test, no show for the fence. Just a black stallion deciding one choice at a time that this man was telling the truth. On the third mount, Luke rode Nightfire at a walk for nearly half the corral, then eased him back to stillness. Catherine checked the sun, though she already knew the answer. 5 minutes in all, counting the settled stretches, twice what he had done before. The neighboring hands exchanged a glance. One of them muttered that the challenge might actually fall. Catherine said nothing. She was listening to the beat of her own heart, which had become an untrustworthy thing. By noon the sky had warmed and more people began to arrive. Word had spread overnight. Catherine almost sent them away. She hated the way a crowd changed men, made them perform their courage or hide their fear behind noise. But Luke did not seem to notice them. He came out of the corral, removed the rope from Nightfire's neck, and stood with one hand on the stallion's shoulder while the horse lowered his head to crop hay from the ground. That sight did more to stir the crowd than any bucking ever had. A dozen people stared as if they had seen a dead man sit up. "You keep at it this afternoon," one rancher called, "and you might take the whole 10 minutes. Luke glanced over without much expression. Might be the horse decides otherwise. That answer made Catherine's mouth almost smile. Almost. She sent for dinner anyway. Bread, beans, cold beef, and buttermilk carried out to the shade beside the barn. Luke ate standing up at first until she told him there was no honor in chewing like a hired hand caught stealing a minute. He sat then, a little awkwardly, across from her on an overturned crate. For a while they spoke only of ranch things, water levels, fence breaks, the price of feed. But quiet sat easy between them in a way that surprised her. She was not used to quiet that felt companionable. Most silence after Eli had been heavy. This one breathed. At length she asked why he never married. Luke wiped his thumb along the rim of his tin plate. "Came near once," he said, "before the war. Thought I had time. Then time turned into other things." "Did she marry someone else?" "No," he looked up then. "She died while I was gone." Catherine felt those words settle inside her like a stone dropped into still water. No grand telling followed. No details. He did not use grief for sympathy. He just sat there with a face gone harder around the edges, and she understood enough. Love had not left him. It had been taken. There was a difference, and it mattered. "I am sorry," she said. Luke gave one short nod. "Me too." That should have ended it. Instead, Catherine found herself telling him about Eli's last ride. She had never told it fully to anyone. Not the banker. Not the preacher. Not the women who came with pies and pity. But there in the shade, with afternoon wind moving through the cottonwoods and nightfire flicking flies with his tail nearby, she spoke. She told Luke how fever had already hollowed Eli out. How he had barely been able to stand that week. How he still walked to the corral because the stallion had been watching the house like he knew something was ending. She told him how the horse had lowered himself into stillness for a dying man. How the ride had looked like grace. How Eli had come back with tears standing in his eyes and said some things are only given to a soul that knows how to carry sorrow without turning cruel. Luke did not interrupt. When she finished, he looked at Nightfire a long time. Then he said, "Maybe the horse has been waiting on the same thing ever since." Catherine drew breath, but no answer came. Because she thought he might be right. Because she feared he might be right. Because if he was right, then all her waiting had not been foolish after all, and that was almost harder to bear than disappointment. Late that afternoon Luke went back into the corral. The crowd had thickened by then. Men leaned on rails. Women shaded their eyes. Boys climbed wagon tongues and fence posts. Catherine wanted to hate them for being there, yet some stubborn part of her wanted witnesses too. If something rare was about to happen, perhaps it deserved more than silence. Nightfire came to Luke almost at once. A murmur moved through the people. Luke laid a hand on the horse's neck, mounted in one smooth, careful motion, and settled deep but light in the seat. Nightfire stood. 1 second, 2. Then he stepped forward with that same measured grace, and Catherine heard someone whisper "Lord" above. Luke guided him into a walk, then let the stallion choose a slow trot around the far side of the pen. Dust lifted gold in the lowering sun. The black horse moved like poured shadow. Luke stayed with him, not mastering him, not pushing him, simply belonging there. Catherine counted in her head without meaning to. 1 minute, 2, 3, 4. Her palms were damp. At 5, Nightfire tossed his head and broke into a sharper trot. A few in the crowd gasped, waiting for the old violence. Luke lowered one hand to the neck and went with the motion. The stallion rounded the turn, blew hard, then slowed on his own. 6 minutes. Catherine's throat tightened so badly she could barely swallow. 7. 8. Nightfire came back to the center and stood with Luke on his back, both of them breathing but calm. Luke looked toward the fence. Toward Catherine. She could not speak, could not move. Because for the first time since burying Eli Sterling, she believed with all her heart that something lost might truly return in another form, and that belief was the most dangerous thing she had touched in years. Nightfire stood in the middle of the corral with Luke on his back. both of them still as if the whole valley had stopped to watch. Catherine's count had reached 8, and then it broke apart inside her. Numbers no longer felt like enough to hold what she was seeing. Dust drifted through the late light. A child at the fence whispered something to his mother and got hushed at once. Luke did not look proud. He did not lift a hand or grin at the crowd. He only sat the stallion with that same quiet attention, as though the ride was not something he had taken but something he had been allowed into. Then Nightfire moved again, not with fury, not with panic. He stepped into a canter so smooth it made the whole crowd lean forward at once. Catherine's breath caught hard. This was the place the others had lost him. This was the place where strength alone failed and nerve turned into fear. The black stallion gathered himself and crossed the corral in long, clean strides, tail lifting, mane flashing, every inch of him alive with power. Luke bent easy with the motion and gave him room. No jerking hands, no crushing knees, no battle. Just a man and a horse moving like they had found a language that belonged only to them. 9 minutes. Catherine knew because the count would not leave her, no matter how badly she wished it would. Her fingers had gone white around the rail. She thought of Eli, fever bright and thin, riding that same black back in the last week of his life. She thought of all the months after, when the house had felt too big and the bed too cold, and every sound on the ranch had reminded her she was the only one left to answer it. She had told herself she kept the challenge alive for the horse, for truth, for the memory of what real horsemanship looked like. Standing there now, watching Luke Merritt pass the mark no other man had reached, she was forced to admit another truth. Part of her had been waiting for proof that her life had not ended with her husband's last breath. Part of her had been waiting to see if God still made second chances. 10 minutes. A man near the back let out a cry, but Catherine did not hear the words. Nightfire had already carried Luke past the terms of the challenge. The stallion slowed on his own, coming down from canter to trot, from trot to walk, each change smooth and deliberate. Luke did not force the stop. He let the horse choose it. That mattered. Catherine saw it and knew the horse saw it too. Nightfire came to rest in the center of the pen, where the sun struck his coat and turned the edges of him blue-black like a storm cloud at dusk. For one heartbeat, the whole ranch sat in complete silence. Then the yard exploded. Men shouted. Boys hollered. Someone slapped the fence rail hard enough to make it ring. One old drover laughed so loud it turned into a cough. Catherine stayed where she was, hands still on the wood, while the noise rushed around her like floodwater. Luke swung down at last, but Nightfire did not bolt away. He stayed close, head lowering toward the cowboy's shoulder with a calm that nearly brought Catherine to her knees. She pushed through the gate before anyone could think to stop her. The crowd quieted some as she crossed the dirt. Luke turned toward her, hat in hand now, hair darkened with sweat, dust on one cheek. He looked almost uncertain, which struck her as a strange mercy after so much certainty from other men. She stopped a few feet away and looked first at Nightfire, then at Luke. "You did it," she said. Luke glanced at the horse. "He let me." That answer broke whatever reserve remained in her face. A small smile came and stayed. It felt unfamiliar there. "You are the first man wise enough to know the difference." She reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out the gold coins that had waited there since the first day of the challenge. The metal glinted in her palm. $50, enough to buy cattle. Enough to buy land. Enough to tempt a poor man into foolishness. She held it out. Luke looked at the coins, then at her, then back at the stallion standing quiet beside him. "Keep it," he said. A few men in the crowd muttered at that. Catherine heard one of them say no sane cowboy turned down gold. She ignored him. "Why?" she asked. Luke took a moment before answering. "Because if I take that money, folks will think this is what I came for. It is not." He rested one hand against Nightfire's neck. "I came because something in that horse sounded like something in me. I think I needed to know whether either one of us still remembered how to trust." No one laughed at that. Even the loudest men by the fence had the good sense to keep still. Catherine closed her fingers around the coins again. She should have thanked him, sent him on his way, and let the whole matter settle into town legend. That would have been the safe thing. But safety had never built a ranch, and it had never warmed a lonely house. She looked at Luke closely, really looked, at the quiet in him, At the old sorrow. At the care he had shown a horse every other man had tried to conquer. Then she looked at the empty stretch of years behind her and the long, hard years that might still lie ahead if she kept choosing only caution. "You riding back out tonight?" she asked. Luke shifted his gaze toward the horizon where evening was starting to gather. "I can, if you need the yard clear." That answer irritated her for reasons she understood too well. She had spent 3 years with men either ordering her about or trying to save her against her will. This one would leave the minute she asked, even after doing something no one else could. It made him more decent than was comfortable. She said the light was dropping and the North Wash ran rough after dark. She said any fool who rode blind through that country invited a broken neck. Then more quietly she added that there was supper in the house if he had sense enough to accept it. Luke's eyes held hers a second longer than before. Then he nodded. "I have enough sense for that, I think." The crowd drifted off slowly, still talking, still turning back to stare at the black stallion who had finally found his rider. A few called congratulations. 1 or 2 called for Luke to come celebrate in town. He declined them all with the same plain calm. By the time the sun dropped behind the mesa and the yard cooled into evening, only the two of them remained by the corral, with Nightfire standing between them like a witness. They walked to the house together in a quiet that did not feel empty. Catherine set stew on the table along with biscuits and preserves put up last summer. Luke washed at the basin and sat only when she told him to. In the lamplight, the kitchen looked softer than it had in years. The walls still held Eli's shelves. His old coffee grinder still sat by the window. For a moment Catherine wondered if bringing another man into this room might feel like betrayal. It did not. That surprised her enough to make her stop in the middle of pouring coffee. Luke noticed, of course. "You all right?" She set the pot down. "I was thinking how long it has been since this room held more than one voice at supper." He lowered his gaze, respectful rather than curious. "Then I will be quiet if that helps." It startled a laugh out of her, a real one, small but real. "No. I believe I have had enough quiet to last one lifetime." So they talked, not about anything grand at first. He told her about the Bar M spread where he had been riding line. She told him which pasture had to be checked for a broken rail by morning. He admitted Buck had a habit of nosing open feed sacks if given half a chance. She told him Nightfire disliked red cloth and men who whistled too much. Little things. Honest things. Yet under each word ran something deeper, a current both of them felt and neither named. At last Catherine asked the question that had been waiting since morning. "Why did you stay alone so long?" Luke turned his spoon once in the stew before answering. "Because once you get used to surviving, it is easy to mistake it for living." He spoke to the table more than to her. "After the war and after losing the woman I meant to marry, it seemed simpler not to need anyone. Horses ask for honesty. Work asks for effort. People ask for parts of you I was not sure I had left." Catherine listened without moving. That kind of answer could not be met with something shallow. She told him Eli had died slow. That slow grief trained a person to become practical because practical things were the only ones you could still control. Feed had to be bought. Books had to be balanced. Men had to be hired. Calves still came in storm season whether your heart was broken or not. She said some days she had kept the ranch alive out of love and some days out of plain stubbornness. Luke looked up then, and what she saw in his face was not pity. It was recognition. "You did more than keep it alive," he said. "You kept faith with it." Those words landed so deep she could not answer at once. After supper they stepped out onto the porch. The valley lay dark and wide under a sky thick with stars. Somewhere near the barn a horse shifted in the straw. Nightfire stood at the fence line, a black shape against silver moonlight as if he meant to keep watch. Catherine wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Luke stood beside the porch rail, hat in his hands, the night wind moving through his hair. "What now?" she asked, though she knew she was asking more than one thing. Luke took his time. "For the challenge, I suppose it is finished. For me and that horse, I do not think it is finished at all." He paused. "If you would have it, I could stay a little while. Help work him, help with the ranch till you say otherwise." Catherine looked out over the land she had fought so hard to keep. then at the man who had ridden the impossible horse without once trying to own him. Fear touched her, cold and old. So did hope. Hope won by one breath. "All right," she said, "stay." Luke nodded once. No promises he could not keep, no bold speech, just that one steady movement, yet it changed the shape of the whole night. When she went to bed later, Catherine stood at her bedroom window and looked toward the bunkhouse where a lamp glowed low again. She had invited a man to remain on her land. More than that, she had invited possibility back into a heart that had nailed every door shut. It should have felt foolish. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of some new country, frightened and alive. Out in the dark, Nightfire gave one low call across the pasture, and Catherine Sterling lay awake long after midnight, knowing the most dangerous part of the story had only just begun. Luke stayed. At first it was only for ranch work, and Catherine repeated that to herself often enough that the words began to sound thin. He took the bunkhouse, rose before dawn, and put his hands wherever the place needed them most. Some mornings he rode fence line before breakfast. Other days he helped move stock, cleared brush from the lower wash, or spent hours repairing gate latches that had been giving trouble since the last hard wind. He did not work like a man trying to impress anybody. He worked like a man grateful for something steady to carry. Catherine had hired good hands before, strong men, skilled men, men who knew cattle and weather and saddle sores, but Luke brought a different kind of quiet to the ranch. The place seemed to settle around him. Nightfire settled too. That was the part no one in Dry Creek could stop talking about. Within a week the black stallion no longer paced the fence whenever Luke came near. He would lift his head from the trough or from grazing, watch the cowboy cross the yard, and then walk toward him on his own. Not eager like a dog, not soft like a barn mare, just willing. That was what made it remarkable. Nightfire had kept his pride. He had kept his fire. But with Luke he no longer looked like a creature waiting for war. He looked like a horse who had decided one man might be worth trusting. Catherine watched from porches, corrals, pasture gates, and wagon tracks, pretending she did so only because Nightfire was too valuable not to be watched. That lie held less and less. What held her now was not just the horse. It was the way Luke moved around him. No wasted force, no sharp temper, no swagger. He asked with his hands. He waited with his body. He listened with his whole frame. Horses answered that. So she was beginning to understand, did lonely people. The ranch changed with the season. Spring came full and green along the creek, and with it came work that crowded every hour. Foals had to be checked. One heifer turned wrong in the night and needed pulling. A stretch of fence on the east pasture went down after two neighbor boys left a gate loose and spooked the cattle. Catherine and Luke rode out together before sunrise to sort that mess. They were both tired, both dirty, both too focused on work to make room for nervousness. Somewhere in those hard practical days, comfort slipped in without asking permission. She began setting an extra plate without thinking. He began bringing in split wood before she asked. At supper, the talk came easier. He told her about a horse he once rode 3 counties too far because he had been too proud to ask directions. She laughed so hard at that, she had to set down her fork. She told him about Eli trying to fix the roof one summer and falling halfway through the smokehouse instead. Luke laughed then, and the sound changed the kitchen. It was warm and low and rusty from lack of use. Catherine realized, listening to it, how little laughter had lived in this house since death had made itself at home. Still, neither of them stepped too quickly toward what was growing. That caution had weight behind it. Catherine carried 3 years of widowhood and the hard lessons that came with it. Men in town had tried to help her in ways that felt too much like taking over. One wanted to manage the books because a woman should not trouble herself with such matters. Another had offered marriage with the tone of a banker proposing a land deal. She had sent them all away. Luke knew none of those details, but he seemed to understand the shape of her caution all the same. He never presumed, never touched her except by accident, never spoke as if a few shared meals gave him any claim on her peace. That made her feel safer. It also made him harder to resist. One evening after a long day moving yearlings, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and wind came hard through the cottonwoods. Catherine and Luke hurried to get the last of the tack under cover while thunder muttered over the mesa. Nightfire was already in the lower shelter, restless but calm. Rain hit in thick slanting sheets just as Catherine ran from the barn to the porch. Her boots slipped on the wet boards. The world tilted. Luke caught her before she went down, one arm around her waist, one hand steady at her elbow. It lasted no more than a second or two, but neither of them moved right away. Rain hammered the roof. Wind snapped at the porch swing chain. Catherine looked up into his face from inches away and saw surprise there and something deeper he was trying hard not to show. His grip was firm without claiming, careful without being afraid of her. She became painfully aware of the warmth of his hand through the wet fabric at her side. "You all right?" he asked. She could have said yes and stepped back. She should have. Instead, she stood there one breath too long, hearing the rain, seeing the strain in his jaw, feeling her own heart beat in places she did not trust. Then she said she was fine and moved away. The space between them returned, but it did not return unchanged. That night she could not settle. The storm passed, leaving the house washed clean and the air cool enough for blankets. Catherine lit no lamp. She sat at the bedroom window and looked toward the bunkhouse where darkness sat quiet. She thought of Eli, and for once the thought did not come with guilt. It came with tenderness. Eli had been good, kind, a man worth mourning. Loving Luke would not erase him. The idea struck her so directly that she stood up from the chair at once, startled by her own honesty. Loving Luke, she had not meant to think it, yet there it was. The next days brought distance, though neither of them named it. Luke worked farther out on the range. Catherine stayed busy with accounts and stock schedules and anything that let her keep her mind from wandering toward the bunkhouse. The silence between them was not hostile, it was careful. Too careful. By the third evening she had become irritated with herself. By the fourth she was irritated with him too, which was unfair and did nothing to improve her temper. On the fifth day Nightfire ended the nonsense. Luke had taken the Stallion into the north pasture to work him over open ground for the first time. Catherine rode out later on her mare to check a water trough and found them on the far rise above the creek. Nightfire was moving in a long, easy canter, not penned now, not contained by rails, and Luke rode him like he belonged to the rhythm instead of controlling it. The sight was enough to stop her cold. Wind moved through the grass in silver waves. The black stallion stretched into the slope with powerful grace. Luke leaned forward slightly, loose and sure, and Catherine felt the same deep ache she had felt the first day in the corral, only stronger now because the land was open and the horse was choosing him all over again. She watched too long. Her mare shifted under her, giving her away. Luke saw her and brought Nightfire down gently, turning toward her. When he rode up, the stallion's neck was damp, his ears easy. Luke's face was open from exertion, hair blown back, eyes clearer than she had ever seen them. Catherine tried to speak of water levels, of fence corners, of anything sensible, but the words came thin and foolish. Luke looked at her a moment, then down at Nightfire's mane. "I have been trying to keep my distance," he said. That startled her into honesty, I noticed. I thought it might be kinder. To whom? He met her gaze then, and all the guardedness she had come to know in him stood stripped bare. To both of us. The truth of that hung between them like held breath. Catherine looked away first, toward the creek, toward the cottonwoods, toward anything but the man who had just admitted what she had been fighting in herself. She said kindness was not always the same thing as running. He was quiet after that. Then he slid from the saddle and stood beside Nightfire with one hand on the reins. "I do not run from work," he said. "I do not run from weather. I do not run from hard ground. But you." He stopped, searching. "You matter enough that I have been afraid to step wrong." Catherine had never wanted poetry from a man. She did not want grand speeches. This plain confession, spoken beside a black stallion under a wide western sky, struck harder than any polished line ever could. She dismounted because sitting higher than him suddenly felt wrong. Her mare dropped her head to graze. Nightfire stood between them for one quiet moment, then moved aside as if he knew his work here had changed. Catherine took 2 steps forward. "So have I," she said. Luke's face changed slowly, as if hope was a light he did not trust at first. He asked what she meant. She told him she had spent 3 years being strong because strength was what the ranch required. She told him loneliness could become a habit if you fed it long enough. She told him that when he first rode into her yard, she thought the danger was that he might fail and leave her disappointed again. But the real danger had been that he would stay and make her want more from life than survival. Her voice broke on the last word, which angered her at once. Luke stepped closer, not touching her yet, giving her room to turn away if she wished. She did not. "I never meant to press on your grief," he said. "You did not." Catherine lifted her chin. "You stepped into it gentle. That is different." For a long second neither of them moved. The wind carried the smell of wet grass and horse sweat and creek water over stone. Somewhere a meadowlark called once and went quiet. Then Luke raised his hand slowly, the same way he had first touched Nightfire, asking without words. Catherine answered by closing the last bit of distance herself. His hand settled against her cheek. Warm, rough, careful. She leaned into it before pride could stop her. The kiss came after, soft at first, two wounded people testing whether tenderness would hold. It did. Then it deepened, not wild, not careless, but full of everything they had both been carrying in silence. When they parted, Catherine kept her forehead near his for a breath, almost dizzy with relief and fear and something sweeter than either. Nightfire snorted beside them and both of them laughed. The sound broke the last of the strain. Luke rested his brow against hers once more and said he had loved the way she stood in a yard full of fools and never lowered her eyes. Catherine told him she had loved the way he treated a proud horse like a living soul instead of a challenge. He said he did not know what came next, only that he did not want to leave. She answered that for the first time in a long while, she did not want a man to leave either. By the time they rode back toward the house, sunset had turned the valley gold. Nothing looked different, yet everything had changed. Catherine knew better than to think love solved a ranch. There would still be work, gossip, storms, market prices, sickness, and loss someday, because loss came for everybody. But beside her rode a man who understood that love was not the end of hardship. It was the reason hardship became bearable. And as Nightfire moved easy under Luke, with his black head high and his spirit unbroken, Catherine knew the stallion had not only chosen a rider. He had chosen the man who would change her life. Love did not come to the Sterling place like lightning. It came like water to dry ground. After that evening by the creek, Catherine and Luke did not rush toward promises just because they had finally named what stood between them. They went on with the work because ranch life did not pause for two hearts learning how to trust. Horses still needed feeding before dawn. Calves still slipped through weak fence in the low pasture. The blacksmith still had to be paid. Yet under all of it ran a warmth that changed the shape of each day. Catherine no longer sat alone over supper unless one of them was truly late from the range. Luke no longer felt like a guest passing through. He began to look at the land the way a man looks at something he means to protect, not merely tend for wages. Nightfire seemed to know it too. The stallion grew stronger through the summer, not softer, not less proud, but settled in a way Catherine had never thought she would see again. Luke rode him across open country, through shallow creek beds, over rocky rises, and along the boundary trails where the wind hit hardest. Never once did the horse lose that fierce brightness in his eye. That mattered to Catherine more than she could say. She had not wanted Nightfire made ordinary. She had only wanted him understood. Luke gave him that. In return, the horse carried him with a trust that looked earned every single day. The town took its time adjusting. Dry Creek always did. At first the talk was all about the ride. Men who had mocked the challenge now spoke as if they had known all along there was one cowboy fit for the stallion. Women in the mercantile asked careful questions about whether Luke meant to stay the season. One old widow smiled at Catherine over a sack of flour and said a house sounded different when grief was no longer the only thing living in it. Catherine answered less sharply than she might have a month before. She no longer felt the need to defend every private piece of happiness like a cornered animal. That surprised her. Not everyone welcomed it, of course. A neighboring rancher named Doyle Mercer, who had once circled around Catherine with the kind of concern that always carried ownership underneath it, stopped by one afternoon and found Luke repairing the west gate. Doyle asked too many questions in too friendly a voice. How long was the hand staying? Was Catherine sure it was wise to trust a drifter so quickly? Did a widow not have enough trouble without bringing in a stranger with war shadows in his face? Luke answered none of it with anger. He just kept driving staples into the post and said the gate would hold better by evening. Catherine came out of the barn in time to hear the rest. She told Doyle the ranch was hers, the decisions were hers, and if he had ridden over only to insult a man doing honest work, he could turn his horse around and take the long road home. Doyle left red-faced. Luke never mentioned it afterward. That, more than any speech, deepened her trust. By the time autumn touched the cottonwoods with gold, the change in the ranch could be felt in every corner. The north cabin no longer stood as an empty shelter with one lamp in the window. Luke still slept there some nights when work ran late in the outer pasture, but more often he was at the house, drinking coffee at dawn with Catherine while the sky paled beyond the porch. They did not need many words in those moments. Sometimes she read over account books while he mended tack. Sometimes he checked a map of the water lines while she kneaded biscuit dough. Ordinary things. That was what made them precious. Their love was not built out of grand declarations. It was built out of shared mornings, tired laughter, and the strange relief of not having to carry life alone. Still, Luke held one fear close. Catherine sensed it before he ever spoke it. He would look at Eli's photograph on the parlor shelf when he thought she was not watching. He would grow quiet on the anniversary of the first ride with Nightfire. He never once acted jealous of a dead man, but grief makes room for doubt in people who have already lost too much. One evening, as they sat on the porch with night coming down over the valley, Catherine asked him to say what was weighing on him. He resisted at first. Then he told her plain. He said he feared being loved only because he had stepped into a place another man once filled. He said Eli sounded like a good man, and good men left large absences behind them. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she told him something she had only just fully understood herself. She said Eli had been her first great love, and she would not lie about that because the dead deserved truth. But she also said grief was not a locked room where a heart stayed forever. It was a valley a person crossed if they kept walking. She took Luke's hand as she said it. She told him he was not standing in another man's shadow. He had come to her in his own right by his own kindness with his own scars, and she loved him not because he reminded her of what she lost, but because he showed her what life could still become. Luke bowed his head over their joined hands, and when he looked up again his eyes were bright in the porch light. He asked her to marry him 3 nights later. There was no audience, no preacher nearby, no polished ring ready in a velvet box. Just a cold October wind moving through the porch rail, Nightfire standing out in the moon-silvered pasture, and Luke turning his hat in his hands like a man who respected the weight of what he was asking. He said he did not have riches beyond his horse sense, his work, and the heart he had nearly buried before he found the Sterling Ranch. He said if she wanted a big speech, he was the wrong man for it. But if she wanted a life built honest, with room for grief, laughter, hard seasons, and loyalty that did not bend, then he wanted that life with her for as long as God gave him breath. Catherine did not answer with a speech either. She stood, walked to him, and put both hands on his face. She looked at the man Nightfire had chosen, the man who had stepped into her sorrow gently and stayed, the man who had taught her that surviving and living were not the same thing. Then she kissed him and said yes against his mouth, once, then again more clearly so he could never doubt he had heard it right. The wedding took place 6 weeks later under a white November sky. Dry Creek turned out in full, because even people who loved gossip loved a good ending more. The preacher came from town. 2 neighboring wives helped Catherine dress. She wore a simple cream gown altered from one of her mother's church dresses, with fresh ribbon at the sleeves and Eli's old silver brooch pinned at the collar, not as a chain to the past, but as a blessing carried forward. Luke wore a clean dark shirt, polished boots, and the look of a man trying not to seem overwhelmed while failing at it in the best possible way. They married outside, not in the parlor. Catherine chose the yard beside the big corral because that was where the story had truly begun. The fence rails stood bright in the thin sun. Dry grass moved in the wind. Night fire was turned out in the near pasture, and when Catherine stepped up beside Luke to speak her vows, the black stallion walked to the fence and stood there, ears forward, watching. A murmur passed through the crowd, then faded. Even the preacher smiled. It felt right, as if the horse who had guarded the door to both their hearts had come to witness what his trust had made possible. Married life did not change them into softer people. It made them steadier ones. They expanded the horse, breeding slowly and with care. Luke trained young stock with the same patience he had given Nightfire. Catherine kept the ranch books strong, bargained hard at market, and never lost her eye for weak fencing or lazy hired help. Together they improved the water system on the south side and rebuilt the north cabin into a proper foreman's house. In the spring of their second year, when a young hand rode and looking half-starved and too proud to ask for mercy, Luke gave him work before the boy had finished explaining himself. Catherine watched that from the porch and smiled because kindness had become part of the ranch now, not a rare visitor. Years later, folks still told the story in Dry Creek. They always began with the widow and the challenge, with the 25 men who failed and the lonely cowboy who won. But the truest version was not about winning at all. It was about a proud horse who refused every false hand. It was about a grieving woman who dared to wait for something real. It was about a weary cowboy who had nearly forgotten that trust could still be offered and received. In the end, the stallion had not been broken. Neither had the people who loved him. They had all been met in their pain and answered with patience. And on quiet evenings, when the valley went gold and the porch boards held the last warmth of day, Catherine would sit beside Luke and watch Nightfire graze the pasture below. Sometimes she would slip her hand into her husband's and think of all the roads that could have carried them elsewhere. Then she would look at the ranch, at the man beside her, at the horse in the field, and feel the deep, sure peace of a life that had not stayed ended. The challenge had brought a cowboy to her gate. Love had made him home.